Welcome to our series on the future of capitalism, and I'm delighted today we're going to be speaking to Bruce Carnegie-Brown, the chairman of Lloyds of London. As you may well know, Lloyds of London is a very powerful institution that looks at risk and insuring for that risk across the world. So it plays this very important, almost pivotal role in global trade and the risks that arise that are event-based or other that happen all over the planet. And they draw that together to see if they can insure for that risk. Bruce has a fascinating background. He's been an investor, a banker, and also been in insurance for a very long time. He brings a lot of experience from this very, very privileged position to us today to talk about the future of capitalism, the risks that we might take, and how we might go about closing the gaps in terms of the UN Sustainable Development Goals. Welcome, Bruce. Great to have you with us.
Good to be here. Thank you.
Bruce, in your own words, would you mind telling us, this job is such a fascinating job. What is the role and what is the importance of really Lloyds of London for the world?
So the important issue around Lloyds is to understand that it's a marketplace rather than a company. So we act as a host to 70 plus syndicates, each of which are underwriting insurance lines of business globally. We've been doing it 300 years, and so I feel the responsibility of making sure we're around to do it for a little while longer yet. And we specialize really in the world's largest and most complex risks, generating revenues of nearly $60 billion a year, investing the premiums that we receive and then paying claims as disasters and issues emerge in the course of an underwriting year. So very engaged in the world's biggest events and therefore very interested in influencing policies that help build resilience into the global economy, and in convening and engaging with other insurance risk takers, because one of the fundamentals of insurance is that risk needs to be shared to be managed properly. But a great privilege to be involved with one of the world's greatest insurance businesses, with a proud tradition, but also one that wants to look forward to address emerging risks, developing risks, be at the center of discussion around how we manage our world.
Bruce, stepping back and this interesting career through investing and then banking and insurance, what are the major macro events through history that really stand out to you?
Well, typically, I think for most people, those fall into the category of things like natural disasters, financial crises, geopolitical events. And I remember even as a young child, so well before ever thinking about a career in banking or insurance, living in Jordan when the Six-Day War started between the Arabs and Israelis, and then only a couple of years later living in Libya when Colonel Gaddafi removed the then in power government, as being quite significant geopolitical events in my early life. And I think as I've sort of developed through career, financial crises around things like the near collapse of Citigroup at the end of the 80s because of Latin American risks principally, the collapse of Baring Brothers in 1995, much more recently the collapse of Lehman Brothers, have all been quite seismic events in my career and had huge impacts on the world in which I operate. And then most recently, of course, the issues of climate change and the impact of global warming on the resources in our planet and the sustainability of the planet itself. These are things that I think have an impact on everybody, and you react by learning to these crises, but some of them are new and they're challenging and they're difficult to understand.
What are the challenges, Bruce, you see today? Because it's interesting. It seems like the roots of understanding risk go a long way back for you personally. And here's this institution that really has to understand global risk. What do you see as the most important challenges and risks facing us today?
So important for me is the balance between risk and reward. And I think any time that you get one of these out of kilter with the other, you create problems for yourself. So I'm absolutely a believer that the capitalist model has proven to be over time the best model for wealth creation. But it's incredibly challenged today in two dimensions, I think. The first is the impact that the creation of wealth has on the natural environment is becoming increasingly an issue in the way that it wasn't even 30 years ago. And secondly, how that wealth gets shared. So the participation of people in the creation of that wealth. And I think the combination, therefore, of wealth creation, wealth distribution, and the impact on the natural environment are the biggest challenges we face.
That's so interesting, because reading the IPCC report, what I notice, I'm going to be very simplistic in terms of summarizing something which I think is a major risk. Under almost every scenario, the south of the world suffers terribly and has the level of disruption that would lead to mass migration. The north of the world has changes that are also profound, but not anywhere near the same extent. But a redistribution of people from the south to the north, even if it was 1% of a population in the north that enters a country, would be enormous in terms of political impact. Risks like that, do you see risks like that are not understood well, perhaps not funded, perhaps not addressed anymore?
Well, I think this concept of looking at emerging risk is something we do all the time at Lloyds, and it's part of the regular work of people in the world of insurance in terms of trying to provide cover for the risks that they see. One of the brave things about insurance is that often it takes on risks it doesn't fully understand, but the only way in which to begin to understand them is to take the risk and then to begin to gather the data. So an easy example of that would be an issue of something like cyber risk. So cyber risk, a relatively new and emerging risk. If you don't provide the insurance, you don't receive the data. And if you don't receive the data, you're unable to do the analysis of how the risk is going to develop. And I think that example of cyber applies in the world of natural catastrophes, the impacts those natural catastrophes then have on things like climate and on population movement. And these things aren't at all fully understood. And they also struggle a little bit with the issue of the timeline. That one of the challenges of capitalism is that it's relatively short-term in nature, and that's compounded by the democratic countries around the world who have political cycles that are somewhere between 3 and 5 years long. And yet a lot of these issues that you're raising in terms of things like population migration, much longer term in terms of their impact. Same with climate change, much longer term in terms of its impact. And so how do we get the right time and attention devoted to things that appear to be today beyond the immediate horizon? Very challenging to do.
Thank you, Bruce. And I've got to agree with you that actually this is such an interesting time where the confluence of these risks seem to be coming together with new risks that we have not looked at before. Can we drill a bit deeper into that and talk about this risk from climate, which you've emphasized a few times? The UN has been working with the financial institutions around the world, but mainly the banks and the asset managers, understandably. They see the financing gap being, a few years ago, estimated at about $40 to $50 trillion. The global capital flows about $450 trillion. Our latest estimates from Force for Good place that gap at about $130 trillion. That's such a large number. It doesn't look as if that gap can be financed, if that number is that big or will be financed. So a different approach is required. In the mission of Lloyds, you speak about sustainability, resilience, and inclusion. How do you see that manifesting to help think about issues like closing that gap?
One of the problems is that when you have numbers as big as the ones you're articulating, they're really hard to grasp. And even if I break it down for myself and look at something like the pandemic in its first year of impact, I think it was The Economist that reproduced an IMF study that suggested in that first year of the pandemic, the G7 economies had invested something like $14 trillion in trying to support their economies. So whether this was furlough schemes for employees or investing in vaccinations. And if you look at the scale of even that at $14 trillion against the total resources of the non-life insurance industry, which globally is about $2 trillion, you can see that even in dealing with a single risk like the pandemic, there's a gap between the private capital that's available and government capital. And part of sustainability, I think, is better partnerships between the private sector and the public sector in coming together around these huge risks. Climate is another one of these risks that is just too large for any individual enterprise or industrial sector to support on its own. And in many ways, it seems the governments are better prepared to pay for the consequences of the problems than to invest in building resilience against those problems happening. And one of the interesting juxtapositions of insurance here is that ultimately insurance is really designed to protect against unexpected loss. To the extent these losses become expected, insurance doesn't really play because the premium ends up equaling the claim. And so if the world is genuinely becoming a more dangerous place from a variety of reasons where claims will arise because events are happening more frequently and with greater impact, then we absolutely need to be investing in our resilience, the resilience of our infrastructure. Otherwise, insurance finds it really difficult to engage and the partnership begins to break down. So there's challenge in there, but there's also huge opportunity. So if I give you another simple example, I look at a place like Florida, a very wealthy part of the world. Hurricanes move through Florida most years. Their impacts seem to be increasing, both the number of named tropical storms that come through Florida, the severity of the impact. But if we look at some of the underlying causes, it's also that populations have been moving into Florida consistently from other parts of the United States over time. They tend to be affluent individuals who've made the move. So these are people who have more expensive lives and more expensive assets to protect. In that population movement, there's more infrastructure being built, which essentially is concreting over the state. And so there's nowhere for the water to run off when these storms come in. And so there's kind of an aggregation of events from natural catastrophes, but human behaviors are creating additional challenges. We've got to come together and think about these things more holistically if we're really going to address these challenges in a smart way.
That's very interesting, because I think you're pointing to something that may be quite profound to find this solution. We focus as a world perhaps on saying we should invest to get the inclusion. But I think you're saying we should invest to create resilience. Is that correct?
Yes. So fundamentally, we absolutely must do that. And if a wealthy economy like the United States is not doing enough of that, what about less wealthy economies, Bangladesh, constantly suffering from natural catastrophes, but without the material and the wealth to be able to create the resilience?
Bruce, is it possible that the level of catastrophe that we expect from climate change keeps rising to an extent where Lloyds of London needs to be far bigger to cope with the consequences of something like this, where we have not built the resilience?
Well, it's not just about size, but size is important for the insurance industry to be relevant. It needs to have enough capital to support its customers who are facing larger and larger risks. But it's also about mitigation against those risks and being smarter about making sure that the risk doesn't arise in the first place. So if I take a simple example, what we know about a factory is that if you install the right kinds of flood prevention, or fire prevention systems, you're going to have less chance of a fire, and therefore you have more affordable insurance premiums. If I look at cyber risk, when we first started developing the product, somebody described this as being a bit like a home ownership product where you're allowed to leave the front door open and the claim is still paid. Well, as the market evolves, clearly as insurers, we prefer that people lock their front door and we protect them from people getting access to their systems through illegal means. And so we begin to develop partnerships with our customers about the mitigation that they put in place so that insurance can not just be available to them, but also affordable. And we know that insurance penetration rates are too low around the world. Not enough of the world's risks are insured. And some of that is down to us in the insurance industry to make our products more relevant and more affordable to our customers. But some of it is about working together to reduce the risk out there so that we can provide the cover. When we get to the issue of sustainability, again, a simple example would be most insurance policies replace on a like-for-like basis. So if your house burns down, we write you a check to rebuild your house as it was before. We're beginning to look at things like, why wouldn't we rebuild the house better with more sustainable materials that might also reduce the chances that it burns down, but certainly have less of an impact on the planet when we reconstruct those buildings. And that's just about being a responsible partner in a world that's increasingly challenged around these kinds of issues.
Bruce, you've drawn so many interesting threads together. So we need to be prepared for these risks. We need to invest in resilience. It seems you're saying also we need to go beyond the normal customer base because of the changes that are happening to find others. Is that part of the strategy of Lloyds of London? Do you have the teams that are analysing the consequences potentially of these major events like climate change to find where the risk might be, what the consequences might be, and how we might address those?
Well, we look at disaster scenarios all the time and what their impact might be and what the impact those disasters might have on our capital. We look at areas that our customers regard as risks where we're not providing solutions and look to provide those solutions. And, while I think the world is very stretched, and I think one of the problems of the capital model is that it's rewarded sort of top line growth and bottom line growth without really testing whether that growth is resilient. We've allowed ourselves to put a lot of debt on our balance sheet, some of it inadvertent in terms of the debt that we've had to put on global government balance sheets to support ourselves through the pandemic. And all of these are actually wearing out our resilience rather than helping build our resilience. The offset to that, I think, is innovation. It's about supporting risk-taking that allows us to look at things differently. Again, a simple example would be as an alternative to fossil fuels, using hydrogen. What we all grew up learning was that hydrogen is incredibly combustible. But we are now engaged with hydrogen manufacturers to see whether we can support with insurance a product that can ultimately replace fossil fuels. And so it's this kind of ingenuity that we need to bring, and the human race, I think, has that innately in it to offset some of these seemingly extraordinary challenges that we face. And it's only by harnessing this issue of taking risk with managing risk that I think we get to the happy outcome we're all looking for.
That's. I'm going to pick up the innovation point too from that. Bruce, in a recent report, Technology is a Force for Good, we found that this massive gap that I spoke about earlier of 130 million or trillion or so, that closing the UN Sustainable Development Goals gap, that cost is enormous. But in the application of innovation, particularly existing technologies to new areas, we could quantify that 40% of the gap could be closed with just the transfer of existing technologies. And that was quite conservative. The estimate probably is 60 to 70% of the gap can be closed in the world on things like poverty and inclusion in education and finance and digital and so on through the transfer of existing technologies. Is there a need, do you think, for the United Nations to engage with the insurance industry, with Lloyds of London and the various partners you have around the world, to try and understand better the risks, to quantify those, to see how we mitigate those with innovation, which could be business model innovations or transfers of technology, to do that?
So I think the insurance industry has a part to play in this. It's not the only sector that has a part to play in this. You identified banking and asset management before as important components of the financial services industry, but absolutely insurance needs to sit alongside that. We are managing risks all the time, so we understand about how to deliver relief at the point of need. We understand how to price risk. We don't always get it right, and indeed the risks change, and so we need to adapt and change our own models as we look at these evolving risks. But we absolutely have a part to play. The other thing, of course, is that the insurance industry collects a lot of its customers' money and holds that money until claims are made against it. One of the things we're advocating for with regulators around the world is that they should free up more of that money to be invested in long-term infrastructure-related projects that might help with the resilience challenge that you identify. Now, we've got to be a bit careful with that. It's absolutely right that we keep a lot of our assets liquid in high credit quality instruments because we take a lot of risk with the other side of our balance sheet. But some of that capital is core capital to the business and could be put to work in longer dated, less liquid kinds of investments that might help with the infrastructure challenges that you identify. And so square this circle of bringing resource to where it's needed from where it currently exists.
Bruce, are there 2 or 3 big things that Lloyds of London are doing that are significant, will make an impact on this mission of making the world more resilient and inclusive and sustainable that you wish to speak about?
For me, the key to the success of insurance in addressing some of the issues we've talked about is 3 things really: cost, confidence, and relevance. So cost, we've got to make our product not just available but affordable to narrow this gap that you identify between the needs of the population broadly defined and where the protection is available. The second issue is around confidence. One of the big distinctions between insurance and other forms of financial services is that in most financial services, at the point a transaction happens, there's an equal exchange of value. I give you dollars, you give me sterling. I buy your business, you give me, I give you money, you give me your business. And if there wasn't an equal exchange of value, the transaction wouldn't happen. In insurance, there's a gap between when you pay me a premium and I pay you a claim, and your claim may never happen, and you may have a view that your money's been wasted if a claim doesn't happen. And so there's a confidence gap between that. And I think that is fundamentally different, therefore, in terms of the way insurance needs to behave with its customers, and particularly because insurance is there for unexpected loss, whereas banking, by and large, deals with very high probabilities in terms of its outcomes. And so when you're dealing with things that are unexpected, there are bound to be conversations about mitigation, what was covered, how did you behave to help reduce the impact of this loss. And then the final piece is relevance. The risks of our customers are changing. They're changing on a daily basis. We are enormously good at insuring bricks and mortar because we've been doing it for 300 years. But if you look at the enterprise value of large corporations, or indeed small corporations, anywhere in the world today, the bricks and mortar are a smaller and smaller part of the value of those enterprises. More and more of that value is in intangible assets, things like reputation, for instance. And how can we play in providing support on those kinds of issues? So these are the things we need to challenge ourselves with in order then to have a seat at the table when we're trying to persuade governments, our customers, that they should be thinking differently about the risks that they're taking.
And out of that, are there specific initiatives that come out of that where you would say, we're doing this and this will have an impact on resilience this way, or inclusion this way, or sustainability this way?
So a good example, some of which we've touched on, we run the Sustainable Markets Initiative Task Force for Insurance, set up by the King when he was Prince of Wales. We look after the insurance vertical. There are verticals in a variety of other industry sectors. And we have a number of objectives within that, one of which we touched on was when we're rebuilding, can we rebuild better and with more sustainable materials? A second one is around looking at developing economies that are most impacted by climate change. So a good example would be islands in Caribbean, in the Pacific, where rising sea levels pose a genuine threat to lives and livelihoods. So we're creating a risk framework with Fiji to understand what kind of resilience they need to build into their economy in order for us then to provide insurance on the back of that, and if that model works, to export it in other places. We also touched on our asset base. How can we use our own assets, the cash that we have, to support our claims, to develop more sustainable strategies, more resilience, more investment in infrastructure. So these are initiatives that we're promoting for ourselves, but also trying to engage fellow insurers. So one of the great opportunities at Lloyds is to be a convener of the power of insurance globally here to make a difference, and then to engage with governments in a consistent way.
And following that through, you explained that Lloyds is a marketplace, and you are a very sophisticated source of information on risk, and you have product that addresses these problems. Do you think the information flow is getting to the right people who make or need to make strategic decisions in governments, transnational organizations, and so on, about the nature of these risks and how they might be addressed?
I think the information is all there. I think it comes back to the earlier part of our conversation around behaviors, priorities, what is it that's important to people. And for me, it's this challenge of trying to get people to look longer term. I'll give you another example. I've just come back from New Zealand. There was an earthquake in Christchurch in New Zealand in 2011, so over 12 years ago now. We are still paying claims from Lloyds of London to help rebuild Christchurch, and we paid claims in excess of 4.62 billion New Zealand dollars for the claims that arose from Christchurch. That is more than all the premium we have ever collected from New Zealand in our history of underwriting business in New Zealand. So if you look at things in isolation, it doesn't make sense to do certain things. But when we look at it in terms of our natural catastrophe risks around the world, we are obviously hedging one risk against another risk. And this is another way of kind of addressing your question of, are we moving resources to a place of need in order to address a concern? And we commission research a lot of the time on these kinds of issues. And what we also identify is that where capital comes in from outside a region to help rebuild, it will rebuild more quickly because you're bringing in capital from outside. Otherwise, you're just redistributing existing resources within an environment or a particular geography. And by definition, you're sort of robbing Peter to pay Paul to address these kinds of issues. So making sure that we can move capital freely to a point of need is a hugely important issue for us. And if capital is all ring-fenced, as regulators sometimes choose to do, then the economic value of insurance begins to break down. So there are lots of things we need to address, and I prefer, I'm in a pragmatic space of trying to knock these things over one by one, and the law of large numbers sometimes gets in the way of that. But I don't think it's an issue of misunderstanding the risks or indeed the emerging risks. It's much more about how we get together behaviorally to address the issues that are in front of us.
That again is so fascinating because there's an accusation that capitalism is, and you alluded to this too, it's short term in its horizon. And the other, perhaps, weakness of capitalism is that it tends to be perhaps overly focused on a particular narrow segment issue and resolving for that issue. And the question often comes up, particularly amongst the large organizations that are global, that are looking for impact, who are saying, if the money is all in New York and the largest banks are in New York, why is that not flowing to the south of the world? And the answer often is, actually, it's not their mandate to do so. But you've just described a model where Lloyds of London has the mandate to actually look globally. And so here's a part of capitalism that works globally, understanding global risk and moving capital across that. Are there lessons for the rest of capitalism to take from Lloyds of London's experience of doing that?
Well, I think open markets are really important, trying to knock down barriers, and I think most people in business would argue that. They believe in global flows, global trade. And actually there has been a lot of transference of value from the developed economies into the emerging economies, and of course the United States in its own way was once an emerging economy benefiting from capital flows coming from Europe, and today the US is exporting capital into emerging markets around the world. The issue is that this happens imperfectly. And it happens in lumpy kinds of ways. And so not everybody feels enfranchised by that. And indeed, there are people in those developed economies who feel left behind when that capital is transferred out of the developed economy into the developing economy. But we just have to be sensitive and inclusive and tolerant around these issues, and to be thoughtful about what happens here. And for the most part, I think people are responsibly minded around these issues. But we often fall into immediacy challenges, focusing on now rather than tomorrow, and also focusing on my issues rather than your issues, without understanding that these issues are collective. And climate change is the great lesson in all of this, right? It doesn't respect geographic boundaries. The pandemic didn't either, and the world had to come together in one form or another. Again, very imperfectly. Most of us looked after ourselves first around vaccines before thinking about looking after other people around vaccines. Climate is the same issue. It doesn't do much good if one of us is very responsible but nobody else is, because because climate issues will transcend boundaries. So I do think bringing people together around this is incredibly important. But again, human behaviors are often quite disappointing. I mean, just as we're thinking that we're in a different place around cooperation geographically, something like the Ukraine war happens, and you get put into a very binary winners and losers or friends and enemies position on quite short-term issues of a war, which are getting in the way of us dealing with longer-term issues like climate change and pandemic.
Bruce, it's fascinating to hear you say that, because in the expression of these issues and the way you've spoken about it, you reveal something about the values required to actually look at the world and address these issues. And we spoke earlier about sustainability and inclusion and resilience, and the need to take a global look and own the collective problems and how these problems cross boundaries. There has been, of course, a lashback in the world, in many democracies in particular, where they're saying we would like to vote for people who look after our narrow interests first. And that's understandable too, where people say, I've been left out and I need you to pay attention again. And as you say, within rich countries, there are pockets, and quite substantial pockets, of people who've been left out. Do you think it is about values?
Well, I think values underpin everything that we do, and actually in many cases are more shared than not shared globally. And it's quite interesting when you look at the backgrounds of various religions around the world. They appear to come from very different places, but often have very similar values underpinning them by way of example. The challenge is the everyday pressures that we face when our values are challenged and how we behave through that. And we've seen these cycles of populism and nationalism happen before, and every time they get broken down and we begin to be more unilateralist or internationalist in our perspectives, we rather take for granted and we think the model is settled, and then something comes along to change that. And so we have to continually be vigilant about how our behaviors and how our activities influence behaviors of others and the world. But again, I think this is all rooted in humanity, isn't it? The
Yes.
great things about humanity
Yes.
and the terrible things about humanity. And ultimately, it's in behaviors. And we all know when bad behaviors happen, and we need to call it out, and we all need to spend more time looking at ourselves to make sure we're behaving in the right way, to try to make sure that we can help the most amount of people the most amount of time. And that's an easy ambition to state, but quite hard to do. And a bit like the march of 1,000 miles, it's kind of one step at a time to get there.
Very well put. Thank you very much for that. I'd like to add a piece to that in terms of capitalism, and you've brought up a few times, and we are so interested in the future of capitalism as perhaps the only model that has generated so much wealth in the world, unequally distributed, but so much, an engine of that wealth creation. How would you change the model, if you could, of capitalism and how it works?
I think that's a very hard question to answer. I start by saying that I think capitalism is the best model out there. It doesn't work in isolation of having the right values and rules around it. And we've seen the bad things that can happen when capitalism moves to a more extreme place. And what the challenge is always that the pendulum then moves the other way. And so we have a failure of capitalism that is then followed by extreme regulation to prevent the excesses of capitalism. And in that extreme regulation, what happens is that innovation and risk-taking are damaged and growth slows, and then that creates its own problems in terms of us being able to meet the aspirations of people around the world. And so it's this constant need to think about regulating this balance between risk and reward, risk and return, innovation versus protection. And I don't think we always get that right. And indeed, I think one of the challenges I identify even in the developed economies and in the democracies of the developed economies is that increasingly those governments are what I would call nationalizing the risks of its citizens, and increasingly creating behaviors in the citizens where they expect the government to bail them out when there are problems. And I'm not sure that transference really works. It can't be the responsibility just of governments. It has to be of individuals as well to be doing the right things in all kinds of different different situations. And I do think there is an innate challenge that has happened in the pandemic when governments rushed to invest to support their citizens. I think it's happening a little bit in climate change, where I'm fine doing what I'm doing, but the government needs to sort out the problem with the carbonization of the atmosphere, for instance. And where do we stand as individuals in terms of what we're doing to support and change that? And some of us are in more privileged positions, and we should be helping not just ourselves but others make the right steps. And it's, there's never going to be a perfect answer to this, but we need to call out when we see the model moving too far in one direction or the other.
I'm going to take that to ask you a question about risk and opportunity and reward. And I think it links very much back to something you said earlier. At a time when there are these emerging risks, and you pointed a few of them that are very global, in terms of how they will impact the world. So we have climate change, you mentioned cyber, the pandemic, and this impact of what is a local war with a global impact. It must be a time for big risk-taking now, with big opportunities, given this level of challenge. Are we structured, do you think? Is capitalism structured, and is the world structured to take on such big risks in a cooperative manner? And are the rewards really there for addressing these risks?
So I think in principle the answer is actually yes. I think humans are extraordinarily adaptable and have shown that over the centuries. And I think capitalism itself is adaptable, particularly if you look at it over long timelines. The issue is always in the short term. How quickly do we respond, and do we respond in the right way initially? I think over time we get things more right than wrong as a human race. But we're not always good in the moment at reacting in the right way. And of course, you get less time to react today than ever you did before because of the immediacy of news and the challenge on what is the answer to the issue. And I think that moment, that time for reflection is less there, which is part of the resilience argument. You need to be better prepared to have rehearsed for when the issue arises, because when the issue arises, you have much less time today than you've ever had at any time before. But I'm net a positive about
I can tell you are. I am too, I've got to say.
I'm an optimist that I think working together we can get to the right outcomes, and we shouldn't let the overwhelming sense of the risks that are out there defeat us in that ambition.
We're a tough, hardy species, and I'm sure we'll figure it out. But and as we do that, and as we draw towards the end of our discussion, our dialogue, let me ask you this. I think someone should be sitting down with you to talk about risk and this massive gap and how we close that gap in a strategic dialogue around what we have to do to be much more resilient and inclusive to achieve the sustainable outcome that we're looking for. And I'm sure that's going to happen following this discussion, if it hasn't happened already. If you could step back and give some advice to the policymakers who are looking at this global scenario and saying, what do we do? What would you say?
I think it's about being clear with what risks belong to individuals and what risks belong to governments. And that's quite difficult to do, and it will vary country by country in terms of the relationship between a government and its citizens. But the governments, I think, need to be much clearer with its citizens about what risks they're willing to share and what risks belong to the individual. And I think that's a very confusing place for people today to understand those issues. We have it, in the UK around care for the elderly. How many assets do you have to have? How much of your own money do you need to spend on that? I was in Australia last year, and the government said that it would pay for the damage caused by wildfires to people who didn't have insurance, but it wouldn't pay for those who did have insurance. Well, what kind of incentive is that sending about whether I should behave responsibly in terms of providing insurance for my risks? And so we send these strange messages out if we're not careful. So we spend our time engaging with governments around the world on these issues and trying to be helpful and thoughtful on these issues. But it isn't easy. It really isn't easy.
I like the fact that you are an optimist, and understanding the risks, you are a conscious optimist and consciously supportive of capitalism and its ability to adapt and make this impact. That's been a fascinating discussion, Bruce. I really appreciate it. You have revealed to us that there is a part of capitalism that is completely global, that looks at risk across the world, that understands that there are emerging risks of a profound nature that affect us all, but might not be perceived to be ones that affect us all from a national perspective. You've also pointed to specifically what these risks are, and you've linked them into the very powerful mission that you have of resilience, so inclusion, to achieve sustainability. And that is the cornerstone of the agenda of the UN Secretary General, looking at the Sustainable Development Goals and closing that gap. And I think you've given lots of clues, ideas, practical ideas also, about what we might do to actually close that gap and the sorts of values we have to do that, and the resilience that we have to have and see in capitalism so that capitalism can adapt to these challenges. I appreciate that very much. Thank you.
No, well, thank you.